All right, we're going to travel way back in time, about 5,000 years, to take a look at a society that pretty much wrote the blueprint for our world. This is the story of Mesopotamia, the civilization that you could argue started it all.
So what's in a name? Well, in this case, just about everything. Mesopotamia is actually a Greek word that means the land between the rivers. And those two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. If you were trying to find this place on a map today, you'd be pointing right at modern-day Iraq. That's our setting.
So that begs the question, right? Why here? Of all the places on our planet, what happened in this one specific valley that earned it this incredible title, the Cradle of Civilization? What was their big secret? Well, the answer starts with the land itself. And you might be surprised to hear it was a pretty dry valley, which, doesn't exactly sound like the easiest place to build a society. So how did they manage to turn this tough landscape into a thriving center of agriculture? Their genius was all about problem solving. They figured out how to tame those rivers with these brilliant irrigation systems. They invented the plow to make farming way more efficient. And then they came up with the wheel and the cart to move all their extra food around. These weren't just simple tools. They were technologies that completely changed the world. But it was so much more than just farming. For the very first time in human history, all the essential ingredients for a really complex society came together in one place. You get a steady food supply, and that leads to cities. Once you have cities, you need a government. That government then has to manage trade. And the glue holding this whole thing together? The absolutely revolutionary invention of writing. And just how successful was this new model for living? Well, it lasted for 3,000 years. I mean, let that sink in for a second. 3 millennia. This was not some flash in the pan. It was a stable, incredibly long-lasting civilization that really did lay the foundation for everything that came after. Okay, so how did they keep a society this complicated running smoothly for so long? They needed what you could call an operating system, a set of rules and beliefs that everyone understood and followed. For them, that system was built on the power of their gods and their kings. This quote from our source material is so important. For the Mesopotamians, religion wasn't just something you did on a certain day of the week. No, it was daily life. They believed that these powerful and often really unpredictable gods were in charge of absolutely everything, from whether the crops grew to whether the rivers flooded. Their whole worldview was polytheistic, meaning they had a god for pretty much everything that mattered. You had Enlil, the top dog, the god of air. Then there was Ishtar, the super important goddess of fertility. En was the god of the heavens, and Enki was in charge of water, maybe the most vital resource of all. To them, these weren't abstract ideas. They were the actual forces managing the entire world. And this belief system directly led to their kind of government, which we call a theocracy. The word literally means rule by God. So in Mesopotamia, the ultimate boss wasn't a person, it was the divine will of the gods. And here's exactly how that worked in the real world. It was a very clear top-down structure. At the very, very top, the gods. They were in charge of everything. They then gave power to the kings, who were basically seen as their managers here on Earth. Those kings, with help from priests and nobles, were then in charge of enforcing the gods' laws and keeping everything in order. So with this whole divine order locked in place, we can now zoom in and look at how the society itself was built. Who were all these people living in the cities? What were their day-to-day lives actually like? This is where we start to see the first real social classes and formal written laws. Their society was structured like a pretty rigid pyramid. Right at the peak, you had the priests and kings, the ones closest to the gods. Just below them were the wealthy merchants and traders. And then you have the biggest section by far, the farmers and the artisans, who made up the vast majority of the population. And at the very bottom of it all were the slaves. Now think about it. How do you possibly manage taxes, keep track of trade deals, and record laws for thousands upon thousands of people? You need a system. You need records. And this very practical problem led to one of Mesopotamia's greatest gifts to humanity, the invention of writing. It was a tool created to organize civilization itself. But how did they enforce all this organization? Well, this quote right here reveals a fascinating and crucial truth about their legal system. Justice was definitely not blind. Where you stood on that social pyramid had a direct impact on how the law treated you. And the contrast here is pretty stark. The stated goal of their laws was actually quite noble, to protect the weak, to make sure everyone got justice, but the reality on the ground, totally different. Power dynamics were literally written into the law. Husbands had power over wives, the rich had power over the poor, and free citizens had power over slaves. Equality was a nice idea, but it wasn't how things actually worked. You know, a civilization that lasts for 3,000 years feels like it should be permanent, doesn't it? But it wasn't. So we have to ask the big question. What on earth could bring down such a powerful and long-lasting empire?
The answer wasn't a sudden invasion or some single big catastrophe. It was much slower, a kind of internal collapse. Over centuries, their intensive farming methods started to degrade the environment. The very same irrigation that gave them life eventually poisoned the soil with salt. Food supplies started to shrink, and over time, people just gradually abandoned the great cities. The cradle, eventually, became empty.
And that leaves us with a really powerful and maybe a little unsettling final thought. They created cities, laws, writing, amazing technology. They built a world that endured for 3 millennia. If the original cradle of civilization could eventually crumble under the weight of its own environmental pressure, what does that say about the foundations of our own?